The annual report for trans people murdered in 2023 was just released. From October 1st, 2022 to September 30th, 2023, 321 trans people were killed. 94% were trans women or trans feminine people. 80% of the victims were people of color, and most of the victims were between 19 and 25 years old. Today is Trans Day of Remembrance, but no matter when you're watching this, we should remember them and say their names. I will be showing a list of all 321 victims this past year. As I show the video, please take a minute to pause and read about these victims, and leave a comment saying their names.
Okay, we get the point. Um, so my name is Ray. Welcome back to my channel. I'm a detransition male, and today we are going to be talking about whether or not there is an epidemic of violence against the transgender community. Because if you sort of listen to the rhetoric that is often used by the trans community, then you might be under the impression that there is this epidemic of trans violence. Um, so, looking at the Human Rights Campaign, one of the biggest, trans activist organizations, they have a whole series of reports called the Epidemic of Violence Report. In this report, we shed light on the epidemic of violence taking the lives of transgender and gender nonconforming people. And they have the epidemic of violence report, talking about the epidemic of violence, in like each year. So when you hear this, when you hear phrases like the epidemic of violence, you might be under the impression that there is an elevated risk of being murdered, or an elevated risk of violence just in virtue of being trans. Because when you say there's an epidemic of violence, then you are implying that there's a higher statistical likelihood of being murdered because you're trans. Now, is that true? If we look at the Trans Murder Monitoring 2023 Global Update, which that TikToker referred to, in 2023, there were 321 trans and diverse people who were murdered between the 1st of October 2022 and the 30th of September 2023. Okay. 321 trans and diverse people. Okay. Well, we need to put that into perspective. So let's actually do some statistics here. So if you look up the actual global murder rate, so murder rates are calculated per 100,000. So I believe this was in 2022 or 2020 or 2023, but there were globally around the world 488,000 people murdered. So that works out to a murder rate per 100,000 of 6.1. So for every 100,000 people, there is a murder rate of 6.1. Now, looking at this tracker here, 321 trans people killed in 2023. If 1% of the global population is trans, that works out to 80 million trans people around the world. Now, if 321 trans people get murdered, that works out to a trans murder rate per 100,000 of 0.40. So compare the global murder rate of 6.1 per 100,000 to the trans murder rate of 0.40 per 100,000. That actually says if you are trans, you are less likely to be murdered. You have a lower chance of being murdered if you are trans. So that does not sound like an epidemic of violence to me. Now, of course, every murder is a tragedy, obviously. But this whole language that the trans activists use, this whole rhetoric, they're constantly talking about epidemics of violence and trans genocide, and everyone is out to get us, and we're being murdered left and right, and we're just, constantly getting murdered, and trans genocide this and trans genocide that. That is misleading. That is very misleading. The actual statistics show that the trans murder rate is lower than the general population. If you are in the general population, you have a higher chance of being murdered in virtue of not being trans compared to if you're trans. Well, what about in the USA? The murder rate in the USA in 2021 was 6.8 per 100,000, which is pretty similar to the global rate of 6.1. Now, in 2022, there were 32 trans people murdered. Now, if 1% of the population is trans, that works out to 3.3 million trans people in the United States, which again works out to a trans murder rate per 100,000 of 0.96. So, again, in the USA, you actually have a significantly lower chance of being murdered if you are trans compared to if you are not trans. So it is actually, there is no epidemic of violence. There is no epidemic of violence against trans people. You actually have a lower chance of being murdered if you are trans compared to if you are not trans. Now, going back to the Trans Murder Monitoring 2023 global update, um, globally, almost half, 48% of murdered trans people, their occupation was sex workers. Now, is this something that is unique to trans sex workers? Are trans sex workers more likely to get murdered or to experience violence than any other type of sex worker, a non trans sex worker? Looking at a systematic review of violence against sex workers, you can see that the lifetime prevalence of any workplace violence, like just yeah, the lifetime prevalence of violence for sex workers was 45 to 75%, over and over the past year 32 to 55%. So it is just common to being a sex worker to experience violence. There is nothing unique about being a trans sex worker that makes you more likely to experience violence. Non trans sex workers also experience violence. So, really, given that half of the murder rate for trans people is just due to the fact of trans sex workers, and there's nothing special about a trans sex worker experiencing violence because that is just part of the trade. That just comes with that occupation because it is just an inherently violent thing to do to be a sex worker. So, um, so yeah, it is. There is no epidemic of violence against trans people, and I want to emphasize that every murder against a trans person is a tragedy. Every, death is a tragedy, but we just live in a pretty messed up world. Like we just live in an inherently violent world. Like murder and violence happens all the time regardless of whether you are trans or not trans. And if you actually look at these statistics, trans people have a lower murder rate compared to non-trans people. So there's no such thing as an epidemic of violence. Um, so it's just like the whole framing of this and the way the activists talk about it, they act as if being transgender is like uniquely vulnerable to experiencing violence. The world is just a violence place. Lots of non-trans people experience violence. There's just an epidemic of violence, period. But there's nothing unique about being trans that makes you, more likely to experience, violence. So the whole framing is just problematic because it feeds into this victim mindset that trans activists have. They sort of set themselves up to be the ultimate victims in society. Like, woe is us, we are trans, we are more hated and more discriminated against than anyone else in the entire world. And and that victim mindset actually has psychologically damaging impacts on the transgender community because that all the activists push this narrative of victim status, playing this game of oppression Olympics. The trans people actually are more likely to experience psychological problems in virtue of believing themselves to be victims. So it causes more anxiety and more depression when you come out as trans because Everything you read online says that you're going to be this ultimate victim. And it is not psychologically healthy to have a victim mindset. It is more psychologically healthy to have a mindset of resilience, to have an optimistic perspective on the world, to not believe that you are at the bottom of the the oppression of the world. Like, but no, the trans activists want to push this narrative that trans people are the ultimate victims, that there's a trans genocide happening, and that and that mindset of believing yourself to be a victim, that is more psychologically damaging than almost anything else, because it feeds into the anxiety and the depression and the comorbid mental health conditions. It exacerbates the existing mental health issues that trans people are already likely to experience in virtue of the fact that being trans is correlated with many comorbid mental health issues such as depression and anxiety. So the victim mindset that the trans activists push, it just makes things worse. And we need to put these statistics into context. And while yes, every trans, victim is a tragedy, we need to push for a world where we just have less violence in general. But there's nothing unique about the trans experience that, like, that like justifies this narrative of, like, trans people being like, super victims who are, the most oppressed minority in the entire world. And like, we have to bend over backwards to like placate, this trans minority because they're such victims. That mindset makes it worse. That mindset feeds into the victim complex, which is psychologically unhealthy. So, if we want to improve the mental health of trans people, then we need to get away from this victim mindset. Okay, that's it for this video. Thanks for watching. Take care. Bye bye.